Hi, I'm Alex.
And I'm Eddie.
Welcome to the 15th episode of Catch 52, a politics podcast brought to you by WDSR Duquesne Student Radio.
We are now 37 weeks away from Inauguration Day 2021.
And we're going to have a slightly lighter episode than last week because more and more states are reopening. So we thought we'd talk about the one thing that makes sense for us to talk about, which is the politics, the electoral politics behind reopening.
Yes.
What does it look like for, prominent politicians? What kind of activities, what kind of reopening measures are constituencies responsive to, and what kinds are they going to protest with AR-15s?
So we've already seen before this week, we've seen pushback from opening too quickly with the Wisconsin primary, where the Democratic-leaning judge got elected after the Republican-leaning court brought everyone out to vote that day. But now, this week, we started to see some pushback from people who believe that this response was too slow in reopening.
Which is interesting, because a majority of the country still thinks that we're reopening too fast. I believe
Yes.
it's an NBC or a Gallup poll that's out that says about 2/3 of the country thinks that we're reopening too fast.
Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, we still have seen protests, especially in the great state of Michigan, where we saw, I'm not sure if they coincided, but we saw both a Second Amendment rally and a First Amendment rally. The First Amendment right to assembly, we saw with a bunch of people who brought their cars downtown, clogged up traffic, started honking their horns around town hall. And then we also saw people bringing their AR-15s into the area around that place, just to protest their Second Amendment rights, because that's really the hot button issue right now, apparently.
Yeah, it was kind of incredible happening. If this was a few weeks ago, there were Michigan state lawmakers basically tweeting out saying, or like pictures of literally masked dudes in like military gear, like wearing tactical vests, helmets, AR-15s with every single kind of attachment that you could imagine. I don't know if they were just AR-15s. I would assume that there's a diverse array of firearms. We make sure that you've got the right amount of firearm representation when you storm the Capitol building. Michigan state lawmakers were wearing body armor, thanking their sergeants at arms over Twitter, because you're allowed to carry a firearm into the Michigan State House. And I guess it means you can also carry a firearm into the balcony above where the legislative proceedings happen. So it was almost kind of, I don't know, it kind of looked like a third world country.
But another consequence that we saw was with the First Amendment protests downtown. One of the streets that they were covering had a firefighter unit there, including an ambulance, and that was very close to a hospital, which meant that ambulances had trouble getting out of the fire station and getting to the hospital once they'd eventually picked those people up. So people probably at least suffered adverse effects from this protest, if not something much more grave.
But I think the president said that they were social distancing, so.
Well, because they were all in their cars, so technically they were all not breaking.
That's true.
Yeah.
No, there was a protest happening in New Jersey where the president weighed in and was like, "Oh, they look like they're social distancing." And it was like, no, they weren't.
No, but that's we're starting to see some pushback from the people who don't necessarily agree with all of what's been happening right now.
Yes.
But what we've also been seeing is a rise in gubernatorial leadership. Gubernatorial leadership
from the gubernators,
both from Republicans and Democrats, and it's been very much not a single party response. So the Democrats have not all responded one way, and the Republicans have not all responded the same way.
Right.
Both governors and other just major political figures in the race.
I will say though, it definitely stinks of ideological splits, though.
Mhm.
You have
Yeah.
the governors who are more ideologically sort of aligned with their state in a
Mhm.
certain way. Um, governors who are probably representative of their populations, regardless of their party identification. And then you have some governors, and this is oftentimes because of the political leanings of their population, but also because of their affiliation to the president, that are not handling the situation with as much grace as one would have hoped.
Mhm. So, one big state, obviously, that has been pretty heavily affected by this and is now under the microscope because of that is New York.
Yeah, you have to start
Um,
with New York
yeah,
because honestly, Governor Cuomo has kind of taken over the country for this.
yeah, we've been hearing a lot from Cuomo. We ourselves have been talking a lot about Cuomo, and that's because he has been everywhere. He's been giving daily press briefings, and kind of been one of the more trusted figures in the nation during this
As
whole
we keep bringing
crisis.
that
Yeah,
up. He's brought his daughter on camera. He's there. I mean, the one thing I would, it's really tough for me to criticize Cuomo about anything. Um, he's not wearing a mask. I mean, yeah, he's social distancing with his
yeah.
advisors, but the optics of that are like head scratching. But like nobody really talks about it because I guess it doesn't matter.
He also is up in Albany, so he's not necessarily in the New York City hotspot. But yeah, it would be a nice
Yeah,
message to be sending that even he is doing that. But he's been a pretty consistent message throughout, and he's been a lot more of a leader than many of our other leaders, regardless of their party.
yeah. It's a combination of like the wonderful thing about the briefings is that every day, and I mean, he's only responsible for giving New York briefings, so you're only getting the New York stats. Um, but every day, the first 2 minutes of every briefing, and I know because my dad watches it without fail every day, um, is the stats. Like, here's the rate, here's the chart with yesterday's stats, the chart of like infections, the chart of deaths, the chart of like, okay, how are our hospitals doing? That's the first 2 minutes every day. So you have like this consistency and this routine that you can get into, and that is really good. And then the next like 15 to 20 minutes are usually him like, I don't want to say rambling, but it's talking about like, we're gonna do this, we're doing this. And then usually like a Monday motivation that you would see on like somebody's Instagram story, and then they like wrap it up after about an hour.
Mhm. That is in harsh contrast to Mayor Bill de
Yeah,
Blasio.
let's talk De Blasio. Here's an instance, okay, of Democrats among Democrats,
Yes.
right? You'd think it's like, okay, you've got Cuomo up in his wooden palace, if you want to call it that, up in Albany. And so it's like, all right, why is Cuomo taking care of New York City? Because you've got America's mayor, right? That should be the mayor of New York City. Seems like a pretty like high profile position, right? And it's like, oh, you got De Blasio, who ran for president. People know who he is. He should be taking care of this, right? No,
Not
he's
at all.
he's not. He's getting into fights with Cuomo, and I don't. And of course, it's different. Nobody knows what's going on. It's so behind the scenes. You have no idea who's right and who's wrong. The big spat came when De Blasio said that they're going to be closing schools until June, and apparently Cuomo was like blindsided by that. He was like,
Yeah.
regardless of whether or not this was a good idea, you have to tell me these things. De Blasio got all in a fuss about it. It's been kind of a hilarious saga.
He's also not had the best tweets, including
Oh yeah,
encouraging
there's
people
that.
to quote, since I'm encouraging New Yorkers to go on with your lives and get out of the town despite the coronavirus, I thought I would offer some film suggestions. Just tweets like that that really, really did not age well at all. Um, it's not a good look for Mayor de Blasio, and it really just like reinforces Cuomo's kind of not very
Oh
quick.
wait, then there's also the anti-Semitism stuff.
Yes, yeah, there is.
Tweeting out basically because New York's Hasidic Jews. That's
Yeah.
yeah. The Hasidic Jewish community in New York City has come under fire with it, and I mean, kind of fairly because they've been having large gatherings in spite of city ordinances saying maybe don't have 300 people get together in close quarters contact. and that community has also experienced a lot of the. They've also been hit by the coronavirus disproportionately hard because of the fact that they have been disobeying stay-at-home orders and things like that.
Yeah.
And people are right to call them out, not for getting together in that way. That said, that community has also been starting to turn the corner, and a lot of those people who were infected by coronavirus and survived it have been donating blood in like very large quantities. So the community has been contributing as well. But at the same time, you can definitely criticize them for the fact that they insisted on having these gatherings regardless of the stay-at-home orders. But de Blasio had this really, really, really terrible tweet where he basically, I should pull up the tweet now. Because basically the funny thing about this gathering is that it was a funeral, and it had actually been pre-approved by the New York police beforehand. Let me see if I can pull this up.
He said,
"My message to the Jewish community and all communities is this simple. The time for warnings has passed. I have instructed the NYPD to proceed immediately to summons or even arrest those who gather in large groups. This is about stopping this disease and saving lives, period."
Keep in mind, this was a funeral of a notable New York City rabbi that many people were at. Everyone was wearing face masks. Obviously, they were not social distancing, but it was a pre-approved event.
That's the thing. He's like,
Yeah.
I'm going to be calling in the NYPD. The NYPD had previously approved it. And the fact that de Blasio didn't know that before he just threw out the tweet is very like, sure, it was probably an honest mistake, but it is very indicative of the leadership mindset that he is approaching this whole crisis with.
Yeah. This is probably one of his biggest embarrassments since having to drop out after the second debate.
I don't know if that was,
he was very, very much not successful in that.
He was just tall
campaign.
and shrill.
But, that's what we've seen from New York State. The other areas where we've been seeing some conflict is in the Midwest, and of course the rest of the Mid-Atlantic region. So we can see a pretty stark contrast between Gretchen Whitmer and Phil Murphy. So that's the governors of Michigan and New Jersey.
Yeah. So let's just talk. I think we can talk like how like presidential relations first, because that's where this whole thing starts. So Trump has been referring to Governor Whitmer as the woman from Michigan.
Yes.
And let's just set aside the fact that this is a really terribly demeaning term, demeaning misogynist term. She's a governor, for God's sake. But it's kind of come out that Michigan has been the source of conflict for the president, whereas it seems like New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy is taking things, is being a little bit more, I don't want to say conciliatory, but seems to be a little bit more cooperative with the president. Now, this might be because New Jersey is, I believe, the second hardest hit state in the country.
One of the, if not.
It might be the second hardest hit per capita.
Yeah, because the New York region in general is so heavily hit, and a lot of New Jersey's population is centered around the New York area. New Jersey was very, very hardly hit also.
So, also, again, these are, like, New Jersey is also a weird state. New Jersey is kind of like an East Coast hotbed of, like, conservative Democrats. But again, it's, like, relatively conservative. And in the same vein as like of like New York Democrats, who are like still quite liberal by national standards, but they've got that like they've got a little bit of like that conservative populist.
It's a little bit of libertarian flavor to their.
That's right. That's a much better way to describe it.
Yeah. But so whereas Phil Murphy's been much more willing to work closely with the president, Gretchen Whitmer has been very vocal in calling out the president for things that she believes he's been doing incorrectly. And the president has been very vocal in calling her out for the same, which is not necessarily the reason, but definitely a reason why all these protests are happening in Michigan and not necessarily in other places. Going back a few weeks ago with the Liberate Michigan tweets, and then all the way now to the people trying to liberate Michigan with their AR-15s in the state capitol.
That's
And
the thing. When the president talks, people listen.
yeah. And then the last kind of divide is the Republicans also. So you see a very, very big difference between Mike DeWine in Ohio and Kim Reynolds in Iowa.
Yeah.
So Mike,
I'd like to throw in
Mhm.
Larry Hogan and Charlie Baker in that as well.
Yes. So Baker and Hogan and DeWine have all kind of been very similar in their actions. DeWine is very much not a friend of left-leaning politics, but he is very much representative. If you were to pull out an average Ohioan, just like the pivotal Ohioan, he'd probably be pretty close to Mike DeWine. But
I think that's fair.
he has been very much in the left in his response, where he locked down the state pretty early. He just a few days ago instituted the yellow warning that we saw in Pennsylvania with Tom Wolfe, where small businesses and other semi-essential places are opening more and have slightly less restrictions on them. So we're seeing that, and you also are seeing that with Maryland. I know Maryland is very similar with Virginia, and they're being much more cautious with this. Both of them have stay-at-home orders until June, and it's a much slower rollout. But what we're seeing from those governors, with Baker in New England and DeWine in the Midwest and Hogan in the Mid-Atlantic, is a uniform response despite party response, or despite party leaning. Iowa is a different case.
So let's just Iowa was not originally a hotspot. Massachusetts was a hotspot, so Charlie Baker kind of jumped on it relatively early. Probably not early enough, but nobody was early enough. Iowa is weird because it has, I mean, typical Iowa, typical conservative place. Sure, it's got a little bit of that libertarian flair as well. And the governor there, Kim Reynolds has been, at least, so from a public relations perspective, Kim Reynolds, until quite recently, was doing a good job. She was giving daily briefings, which I guess is like the minimum standard that we're going by. I don't know if they were daily briefings, but she was giving, like, the governor's office was giving regular updates. And now Iowa had partnered with a conglomerate of Utah tech startups. And this is just a weird thing. So the companies that are from Utah are from a section of Utah, not called Silicon Valley, but called the Silicon Slopes. I don't know, but I think it's a pretty fitting name, because it's like they're trying to be Silicon Valley, but they were not successful. And what I mean by that they were not successful is that these group of companies got together and basically told the Utah governor, who I cannot remember their name at this time. So they told the Utah government, hey, we'll start doing all your testing for you. And after like negotiations, also the group of companies that are doing the testing is being run by a guy who is publicly questioned having doctors on his team. I will find that name momentarily. But basically, this group of tech startups got together. They founded a company or an organization called Test Utah. Right? Cool. Test Utah was, in theory, such a big success in Utah. It actually turned out that it wasn't. That Kim Reynolds awarded this organization a bunch of no-bid contracts. Democracy in action. And so now they're doing Test Iowa. Awesome. We're going to test all of Iowa. The tests are like 30% reliable at best. At that point, you should just be importing from the Chinese. And she's had to apologize not only for a backlog of tests, which was supposed to be sort of where this organization was going to come together, because, like, sure, maybe the tests don't work, but you were going to get your test back, because that's been a huge complaint around the country, right? Backlog tests. Mm-hmm. But there's been test backlogs too. So it's been a really, really rough situation. And despite the fact that she's been in regular communication with the White House, specifically the White House task force and Jared Kushner, it's not been going terribly well in Iowa.
And it's also important to mention that Iowa, alongside their neighboring similar states of Nebraska, the Dakotas, and Wyoming, never issued a stay-at-home order.
Yeah.
Nor did they issue a stay-at-home directive, nor did they issue a stay-at-home guidance, whatever you want to call them. However binding they are, Kim Reynolds said, quote, "I cannot issue a stay-at-home order." Or I cannot lock down the state, is what she said. So that has really affected Iowa, because out of all those states, that's the one with the major population centers, maybe Nebraska also. But, to say I can't lock the state down has really, really hurt Iowa, because it's allowed the case to spread very fast. And they're one of the 7 states that has not done that.
Yeah. It's not recommended that Iowa go into a quote unquote phase yellow, but they were never in a phase yellow. And so a lot of so some experts are sort of trying to predict. I can't believe that we have people trying to do this, but I guess it makes sense. There are people who are at work predicting like where are sort of the last places that this virus is going to be in the country whenever we get it under control, whether that's in the next 6 months, whether it's in the next 18 months. And those models have Iowa as, some of them have Iowa as like the last state to be free from coronavirus. And
I mean, if you look at the states that have been the hardest hit, that you wouldn't expect to be the hardest hit, Georgia. There's a pattern. But Georgia's one, but Georgia also has Atlanta, so it kind of balances out. If you look at cities without major populations that also have large number of cases, you have Arkansas, Iowa, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Utah, Wyoming. Those 7 states also have no stay-at-home orders, and also have Republican governors that have not been issuing these stay-at-home orders. And again, this is not saying that this is a Republican problem, because you have like Charlie Bakers and Larry Hogans and Mike DeWines who are being very, very responsible, but you don't see that in these other states.
So why might, though, it be a Republican problem? Why might it be a problem that
concerns Republicans?
Conservative Republican governors, conservative Republican states are experiencing. Perhaps it's because the head of their party is consistently advocating for a return to normal, in advocating against stay-at-home orders.
Trump has been very back and forth as to whether or not he agrees with them. And in press briefings, he's typically okay with stay-at-home orders, but then once he gets off the press briefings and once he gets on his phone on Twitter, it's very different, where he's calling for liberation of people that are staying at home.
Also, the amount of communication that, and I don't just mean like Trump himself, but specifically the White House and individual influential members of Trump's inner circle, the amount of communications that those people have had with specific questionably economically significant, but definitely electorally significant voter bases has been incredible. So there's been a lot of back and forth communication between the White House and meatpacking plants. And not meatpacking plant unions, meatpacking plant executives. There's a meatpacking plant, I believe in I believe it's in this one says it's in Pennsylvania. I don't know if it's here. But the company the company that I'm referring to is called JBS USA. JBS USA has a meatpacking plant in, this is Greeley, Colorado. That's where it is. And so this plant in Greeley, Colorado has been in direct communication with the president. And I feel like meatpacking union workers are among the voters that Trump is trying to get out the vote. He's trying to motivate those voters. He's been in contact with that meatpacking plant's executives, and they announced a few weeks ago that every single employee was going to be tested. Well, after they tested the managers and mid-level executives and found between 40 and 80% of those people to be coronavirus positive, they decided not to test the
actual people working,
the actual workers. But they then still asked them to come to work without testing them. Ah,
Yeah.
it's
The response, I think the one worse thing than a bad response is a mixed response where people can't even tell whether the response is good or bad. Because, at least when you have people giving bad advice, just to ignore it. But half the time Trump's not giving bad advice and telling people to abide by stay-at-home orders and saying, listen to Anthony Fauci. He's saying the truth. And it's further complicating the situation itself and also the situation for Trump electorally as he continues to confuse voters, which will only push them away from him in the future.
well,
Well,
that's the question.
yeah.
If you
Speak.
confuse voters, what
Yes,
happens?
we'll find that out. Speaking of the future and things that might be confusing to voters, the other thing we wanted to talk about this episode is the Kansas Democratic primary that happened just a few days ago. So,
Yeah.
Kansas Democratic primary happened. Surprise, surprise. Joe Biden had 75% of the vote.
What?
To be expected from a one candidate race.
And also
What
from Kansas.
is also surprising, though, is last time Kansas came around in 2016, they voted for Bernie Sanders with a 2/3 majority over Hillary Clinton. Um, but what also is surprising is that voter turnout quadrupled from the
Okay, hang
last
on, hang on.
election.
You said originally in our episode prep, you said that
Yeah.
it doubled and then you said it tripled. Now you're saying
Okay.
it quadrupled.
So it
Explain.
went from 40,000, just under 40,000, to 140,000.
So it almost quadrupled.
So it almost quadrupled in size. 100,000 extra Democratic voters turned out um, in Kansas. So I don't think that it's just because the party tripled in size, because Kansas has typically had like a semi-strong Democratic Party, stronger than you might expect. They run pretty good candidates for their congressional offices in Kansas, and that's what we saw with Kansas having a Democratic governor and having at least one Democratic representative out of their four, uh, which was somewhat upset. And then also, other races are getting closer. But what is really, really surprising is that 100,000 extra people came out to vote. Um, part of that is because there's a quarantine, so what else are you going to do except request your absentee ballot? But people went through the process of requesting an absentee ballot, filling it out, and mailing it back. Now, I'm saying that there's an absentee ballot here, and that's really important because in 2016, Kansas had a caucus. And in that caucus, Bernie pretty much cleaned house. But now, Kansas doesn't have a caucus anymore. But they also don't just have voting, they have what a lot of people are saying is kind of the future of voting for primaries, especially, but also just for general contests. Something that would also give third parties a chance, and that's ranked choice voting.
Ranked choice
Um,
voting.
yes.
It's okay. And this is so I'm just looking into it.
Mhm.
Actually, before I say what I was going to say, explain like what ranked choice voting is
All right.
and why
So
it's different.
it's pretty simple. It's kind of like the wake. It works very similar to caucuses, but just on paper. So what you do is it's pretty self-explanatory. You are given your choices. So on this ballot in Kansas, it was Biden, Sanders, Warren, Gabbard, or no one. And you have your 5 choices, and you rank them based on who you like the most to the least. So you could say Biden, no one, Sanders, Gabbard, Warren, for example, and or let's change this up. So let's say you say Gabbard, no one, Warren, Sanders, Biden. So the other way
That's
around.
definitely the right order.
So Gabbard only got 1% of the vote, but that 1% of the vote, those people that voted for her number one, all of those votes go to their number two choice. So if you voted Gabbard and then Biden, your vote then goes to Biden. And if you voted Gabbard then no one, then your vote goes to no one, etc. And so you keep lowering it down until all the candidates who have over 10% are left. And so what this does is it makes sure that everyone's voice is heard in a way that gives candidates a good amount of the vote. So in the same way caucuses work, where if you don't have 10% of the people, then you have to move to your next choice. It just does that, but on numbers and paper, and it can be calculated super quickly.
Yep.
And what we saw with that is it's a more democratic process, because let's say you really like this third party candidate. Let's say in 2016 you were a really big, Gary Johnson supporter, but you also don't want to see Trump get elected. What you could do is vote for Gary Johnson and then have your second vote be for Hillary Clinton, and then your third vote be for Jill Stein, your fourth vote be for Donald Trump. And what would happen then is you would see more people hypothetically vote for third parties as their first choice. You'd see third parties gain support, especially just over elections over time, as a major party. And then the parties that people don't like would be lower ranked. And so while they would still get that vote, so the whole third party throwing elections would no longer be a thing, what you would see happen is a move over to other parties that might better represent the American people's interests.
Wow, imagine that.
Yeah. So
And you're going to have more in-depth polling, like from real data.
So where caucuses are really successful is the fact that people have their voices heard and are able to make sure that their vote goes to a candidate who actually has a chance at winning. And in the same way that caucuses are able to do that, ranked choice voting is able to do that among a population that can't necessarily meet, whether that just be because of their size or whether that be because of an event like this where there's, a pandemic and you can't necessarily meet as an entire precinct and vote.
So there is an elephant in the room to this, though.
Yes, which is,
what is this increase in voter turnout the result of? Because in-person voting did take place on May 2nd.
Mm-hmm.
So, but registered Democrats on March 30th received mail-in ballots. So there was universal mail-in for Okay, hang on. Universal mail-in voting for those who wanted.
Yes, to quote Mayor Pete.
So universal mail-in voting for those who wanted. God, that's a mouthful. Started on March 30th.
Yes.
Deadline to the postmark deadline. I'm 20 years old. I don't know what that means. But the postmark deadline to return completed mail-in ballots was April 24th. So they had a month to do it. And then in-person voting happened across the state on May 2nd, but it only lasted from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m.
Yeah, just to make
so some people might have slept through it.
Yeah, but
despite
what you
that,
still saw was 100,000 extra people turn out to vote.
Exactly,
100,000 in the state of Kansas. That's a significant amount of Kansas's population. Also,
is it? Now I'm curious. How many people?
Kansas is like 3 million, I think, but
3 million, 100,000. I mean, this is a Democratic primary.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. 2.9 million. Okay.
Yep. 3 million. So it's still, a significant amount of the population in a change that came out to vote, especially in a Democratic primary. In Kansas, Kansas is not necessarily the most left-leaning state. In the middle of a global pandemic, 140,000 Democrats came out to vote. This is a closed primary, so it was only Democrats. Also, it wasn't an independent, it wasn't any Republicans. It was only Democrats.
And sure, if we're gonna put if we're gonna put 140,000 beside 3 million, it's like, aren't there more Democrats even though they elected a Democratic governor? It's like, yeah, you're right, but it's not about like how few people came out. It's about how many more people came out than before.
40,
turnout quadrupled.
Yeah, and that's almost incomprehensible to see turnout go up by 3.5 times.
Here's what I should have said.
Yes.
What is this the result of? Is this a result of people being, yes, finally, ranked choice voting, oh my God? Or is it the result of, man, coronavirus is keeping me locked down in my house. I'm bored. Oh, here's a mail-in ballot. Here's something to do.
I don't think it's necessarily as much of a yay, no more ranked choice voting as much as it's a yay, no more caucuses. Obviously we talked about it a lot in our second episode and a lot of our episodes since, but the Iowa caucuses were not that successful. There was a little bit of confusion. But what wouldn't have been confusing is if those people had just written their choices down on a slip of paper and sent them all in, like you had with Kansas. And so while the nice thing about ranked choice voting is, while a lot of the people in Iowa and Kansas where caucuses are really big, they really stress the importance of having choices in your primary. That follows over. So you're not losing anything except for talking to people, which you can do outside of the caucus itself about politics. So the one thing that is lost is talking to people right as you vote. But other than that, everything about it is the same. You have that same sense of being able to choose all the candidates you want in the order that you like them.
And I honestly, I think that sure there's a benefit of being able to talk it out in the caucus forum,
Mhm.
and that's definitely something that statewide parties have to decide on for themselves.
Yeah.
But also, if you're really concerned about getting like voter turnout up for your primaries,
Mhm.
I have a feeling that getting all of like the insufferable political nerds and putting them in one room and forcing them to talk to each other is not exactly a great way to generate turnout among people who might be more representative of the electorate.
Yeah, let's say like if you're someone working hard every day and you need, to go out and do your job that day, taking an hour plus out of your day to talk to people about politics and then stand in a group of people, wait for your numbers to be counted, then move to another group of people. It's just not as sustainable of a system.
People who don't have the time to do that can't do that.
Yeah.
And also there's people who frankly number one don't care and just don't want to. Like politics stresses some people out.
Yeah.
Politics makes some people angry. That's totally fair. So there might be people who are like, well, I want the chance to have my voice heard, and I want to take advantage of my constitutional rights, and I want to support the Democratic Party because, you know, I like, I want Joe Biden to do well. But also, that might be the kind of person who is really, really, really not so politically oriented and is just kind of there to vote and go on with their life. So
And
caucuses may definitely dissuade those people from showing up.
another thing is you do not have to rank every candidate on that list. So I think there were about 1,000 people that didn't rank someone that wasn't Bernie or Sanders. So people that only voted for Warren, no one, or Gabbard, or any combination of the three, their ballot counts as a vote for no one, which is still registered as a vote for no one. But like, that's the thing
Honestly, that sends a super important message.
with ranked choice voting. It gives people a much more democratic share
Right.
of who their candidate is. I know personally, I would have loved to rank choice vote. I think that
I think you would have just liked to vote.
I mean, yeah, but the nice thing about ranked choice voting is that it gives you this whole opportunity to really choose whoever you want, and it doesn't take that much more effort than just a normal vote, but it takes so much less effort than a caucus for the same
Yes.
result. It brings every state up to that same level of representation that the caucus has without having everyone to have to go through a caucus. And I think that's really important. And I think that could be the future of primary voting, especially, but also general election voting. I think seeing congressional elections and ranked choice voting would be very interesting. I think you'd see a lot more third party candidates in Congress, which could really help change the entire situation that we have in Congress.
For something I just thought of, how the heck would ranked choice voting work with the electoral college? Because at the end of the day, the popular vote doesn't matter. It's the electoral college that matters. So
Well,
ranked choice voting among
yeah,
electors?
each party chooses their electors. So, I mean, if the Libertarian Party picked up 2 seats in New Hampshire, then they'd choose who their electors are.
And so
Because
then
what
do those electors
technically,
have to stick to like the conglomerate? So then do those electors have a ranked choice voting? So like if you're an
probably not.
elector
So
and
typically the
you
way
are at you,
All right. So typically the way so here's how voting actually works in America. You do not vote for a candidate, you vote for a party.
right.
So when you vote for, if you in that 2016 election, when you vote for Hillary Clinton, you are not voting for Hillary Clinton. You are voting for the Democratic Party of your state to choose someone who will vote for Hillary Clinton. And so in the same
Well,
way,
that's not like officially how it works, but like essentially that's how it
that's
goes.
essentially how it works. Technically, you're just choosing someone who represents Hillary Clinton to vote for. It's very complicated, but
Right.
essentially what you're doing is you're saying I want the Virginia Democratic Party to vote to choose someone who will promise to vote for Hillary Clinton. And so when you vote for the Libertarian ticket, you're saying I want the Libertarian Party of Virginia to vote for to send a delegate who will vote for Gary Johnson to be president of the United States. What you'll probably see is a lot more results eventually, not immediately, but eventually you might see a lot more results where that 270 majority is not reached, and you're going to have Congress decide, which is why ranked choice voting in Congress is important also, because then you actually have states with a multiple party breakdown deciding who they're going to vote for president.
See, that's the thing so this is where I'm lost a little bit. And I think this could work. But I just don't know how like the mechanics of it.
Yeah.
So if you are I guess my so let's say like hypothetically 2028 sweeping revolution, a revolution sweeps the country, and the revolution wants one thing: ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
um and they do all the constitutional amendments that need to
It
be
actually
made
wouldn't
to
need
make
any
it happen.
constitutional amendment. It would just be within the state. It would be each state's party deciding to do that. It was the Kansas Democratic Party that agreed to do ranked choice voting. It has nothing to do with the Constitution, actually.
No, I'm talking general election right now.
Okay, well, that would just be Congress that decides then, probably.
I have a funny feeling that'll require a constitutional amendment.
But anyways,
You're
yes.
fundamentally changing the way that voting happens, though. Anyway, point
I
being,
don't think the Constitution says anything about that. But yes, it would be a constitutional issue at the very least. But
yeah, it would get brought up.
Yeah.
Some activist judge would make it happen. So ranked choice voting happens in 2028. Everybody's behind it, regardless of whether they're happy or not. It's going on, right?
Mhm.
I think it's fair to assume that you would still have most people choosing the Republicans or Democrats as their first choice. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
So what happens then to those electors? But I bet that there would be a higher like percentage of first choice third parties. First choice Green Party, first choice Libertarian Party. And so I think it's also fair to say that there would be some electors that were there who were Green Party or Libertarian Party. Because it's ranked choice voting, would those electors then be forced to go to like their collective second choice?
Well, I don't think the Electoral College would vote ranked choice because it's not the whole point of the Electoral College is it's not the choice of the electors. It's the point of the modern Electoral College is that it's not the choice of the electors, it's the choice of the people who elect the electors.
But at the end of the day, legally, it still electors. Is the same.
Yeah. But I think that ultimately what we would see is probably not ranked choice voting among electors, but ranked choice voting among the people who elect the electors, the American people.
But I guess here's what I'm saying. If we're doing ranked choice voting among what electors are being elected, then it's still exactly the same. And third party voters would filter back to either third party voters for a long time would filter back to the main two parties.
What would happen is third party electors would get elected and they would vote for their candidate, and you would have split states because a state does not have to vote uniformly. They just typically do. But what would happen is in a ranked choice voting system, you might have states where you have electors chosen from a Libertarian Party. And this would also require, you see this especially in states like Maine and Nebraska, who have that electoral system that allows for non-uniform decisions. So you would see, especially in Maine, and probably in Nebraska too, the Libertarian Party have pretty strong outings and then actually get electors and get the first third party electoral votes since probably Teddy Roosevelt.
So then my question is, what about those states states don't have to vote uniformly? Is that what you're saying?
They don't have to constitutionally. No, not at all. That's just the state's.
Okay. So that's I think where the disconnect was
decision.
For me.
Yeah. So each state decides how their own elections work. So the fact that 48 states vote winner takes all regardless is just their own decision. But what actually it could go however they want. So they could make it that they could technically make it that half the votes automatically go to one party, half the votes go to the other, and then there's only one deciding vote. They could do whatever they want, but the only thing that they have to do is just elect electors. Technically, I don't know if states even need to have people vote. That would be a definite that would be a huge issue, but states determine their own voting regulations, which is why for a long time in some states African Americans could vote, in some states women could vote until those amendments said that they have to be able to vote. But I mean, that's why Maine and Nebraska systems are the way they are, because Maine and Nebraska said they want them to be like that. And if states have that way also, so that each congressional district elects its own person, then we are really going to see third parties start to have a resurgence in America.
Yeah, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe the two parties would come together and stamp them out.
Who knows?
They're pretty much doing that right now.
But that's kind of the future of voting. That's kind of the future of what we might see in, we could see ranked choice elections happen in this upcoming election is we might be voting via mail. So, we don't really know.
I wouldn't hold my breath.
No, I wouldn't either. But it is now 5:07 p.m. on this Friday afternoon, so our time is just about up.
We actually did a shorter episode this time. Imagine that. Apologies for the late upload last week. But we're now done with school, so
we'll be on time.
We're gonna have a lot more guests. We will be having guests next week.
Yes.
And it will be a sort of a foreign policy special. Look for our Twitter, Facebook for updates regarding that. But as always, our intro and outro music is by Paul Abrams and Rock Solid Panda, and it's been produced by Elise Duda.
You can also find a recording of this podcast on our YouTube channel, our Spotify, our iTunes, or whatever you use to listen to your podcast.
Are we on iTunes now?
We're on everything. We've been on iTunes for a while, but you can also make sure to follow us on all of our social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just like Alex said, stay updated on our air times, our episode topics, and our upcoming guests who we'll be having next week.
Hey! And please, we welcome your comments, your feedback, your suggestions. I'd love to hear some suggestions regarding this whole debate on ranked choice voting. Is it constitutionally possible? How might it be, brought about? Because electoral reform seems pretty rough these days. And so, have a good Friday and a great weekend.